Why do some people argue that the King James Version is the best English translation? Before I answer that question, we have to understand a bit about what the KJV is and where it came from, especially regarding the New Testament. So the KJV has about 16 verses that are not in most of our modern translations, and there are some translational differences between modern translations and the KJV. The question is, why are those differences there, and how do we weigh them? The King James was translated in 1611, but it leaned on earlier English translations that took place between 1525-ish and 1568-ish. Behind the King James New Testament is a Greek version of the New Testament called Textus Receptus. Textus Receptus can be traced back to 1516, when a scholar named Erasmus used a handful of later Byzantine texts to compile a Greek New Testament. It went through various revisions up to 1535-ish, and that's when Textus Receptus came to be as we know it. After the KJV was published in 1611, lots of important manuscripts were discovered. And these were something like 900 to 1,000-ish years older than what the KJV translators had to use. In fact, the oldest New Testament manuscripts came to light in the 1930s. When these older New Testament manuscripts were compared with Textus Receptus, it became apparent that Textus Receptus represented a New Testament that had slightly grown over time. The parts of Textus Receptus which were added later and not original to the New Testament were then removed from subsequent translations. The verse numbers were left intact, so it appears at times in our New Testaments today that a number is skipped. That's because once upon a time there was a verse there from Textus Receptus that is no longer in our New Testaments. Here's an example. In Matthew 18, you will find a verse 11 in the KJV based on what was found in Textus Receptus. But upon comparison with older manuscripts, it was deemed to be an added verse, so it has since been removed. And below in the NRSV, you can see that verse 11 does not occur. The text jumps from verse 10 to verse 12. So we're talking about 16 verses that were in Textus Receptus and that occur in the KJV that are no longer in most modern translations. Now, just to be clear, there's no theological principles at stake with these verses, either absent or present. However, some people have raised concerns over the removal of the added verses. For example, in 1881, the Revised Version was published, and this version brought to the public light these added verses for the first time. And in response, there was some serious resistance. Why? Because Textus Receptus had been accepted for so long that the removal of the added verses was viewed as an attack on the church. In addition to the form of the New Testament behind the translation is the nature of the King James translation itself, both Old and New Testaments. When it comes to translation, there are a few things to keep in mind. First, today we know Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek better than they did back in the 1600s. Secondly, we speak a different variety of English today than was used back in the 1600s. So the 1611 English doesn't make much sense to us. Third, the KJV leaned on earlier English translations. So these three things in combination result in some translations found in the KJV that are no longer found in our translations today. So I'm trying to say a couple things about the KJV translators. One, they weren't quite as skilled as we are today linguistically. Two, they were working with a slightly expanded Greek New Testament. Now, to be fair, a few people here and there have tried to defend Textus Receptus, but that has not been accepted. Now that brings us back to the original question. Why would anyone argue that the KJV is the best English translation? The only answer to that is tradition, that folks have inherited a tradition that says it's the best. But the evidence does not support that, and to say the KJV is better than all of our English translations is misleading. Now I'll end with this. There's nothing wrong with using the KJV. If you love it and you're used to it, go ahead and use it.